a good number of you know me, know the National Farm Animal Care Council. There's certainly a number of new faces in the room. And so you know that the National Farm Animal Care Council oversees the process by which codes are developed. But one of the things that we don't do is, we have these great codes, and a lot of effort goes into them. But then the delivery, how do you get them from, all that work that goes into creating them, and how do you get them into the hands of the people that need to be using them? And so I really think what Mike has described in Impact is a really great opportunity to take what has happened at the national level and deliver it provincially, at least in Ontario. And I think there's probably been interest from other provinces as well to piggyback on what's being done. So for me, this is really exciting to listen to and to see this happening, because a whole lot of effort goes into developing these codes. A lot of people put a lot of, well, maybe not actual blood, but it probably feels like there's a lot of bloodletting and a lot of sweat and a lot of tears that goes into developing the codes. So this is a really wonderful opportunity to take them to the next step. So thank you very much to all the folks at Farm and Food Care for putting together this project, and to the Ontario government for funding it. So just a little bit about the National Farm Animal Care Council, in case you aren't aware. We are a very collaborative, oops, maybe that is working now. I'll go like this. Sorry, guys. We are a very collaborative partnership of diverse stakeholders, and our partnership keeps growing. There's more and more members joining every few months, and I'll have a slide showing you who all are members and partners on the National Farm Animal Care Council. We are considered to be the national lead for farm animal care in Canada. And what we do, you're never going to see NFACC come out and say a particular procedure is good or bad. We are a process-based organization. So we create the processes by which all the different players who have responsibilities, interest, authority, jurisdiction in animal care and welfare, where all of these different groups can come together and figure out what are the expectations when it comes to animal care in Canada. How do we want to operate on a level playing field across the country? So we don't, I'll stay away from that microphone. We don't tell anyone what should be happening. We trust the experts that come around the table at the Code Development Committee to, does this turn? I thought it was off.
Just take it.
Take it away, yes. And so codes of practice are what I'm going to be talking about today. How we do it. Everything is done by consensus at NFACC. So there's no voting, pretty much no voting on NFACC. So it means that we don't operate at lightning speed. We're kind of in the tortoise and hare race. We're the tortoise for sure. But it's all about cultivating these relationships. And what's really important around the NFACC table, because we do involve groups that normally don't talk to each other. So for example, my Canadian Federation of Humane Societies representative, hopefully by the relationships that are developed around the table, when they're hearing about something that's going on, instead of connecting with another activist group to find out what's going on, they're going to pick up the phone and they're going to call one of the commodity association reps that they know, and they're going to have that conversation there. And in fact, it has happened. We have had a number of examples where something's popped up and the phone calls are direct and really avoid a lot of issues that otherwise may have become something that came into the public realm. So the real aim is to have real progress on farm animal welfare while maintaining the viability of Canadian animal agriculture. Not an easy task. These are all of NFACC's partners, and I appreciate that you probably can't read this slide, and it's gotten a lot busier as we've continued to grow. The first third of that slide is really all the national commodity associations. So virtually every national commodity association is a member of NFACC. So probably for most of you in your room, your national industry group is a member. And a good portion of the rest of the slide are other industry partners. So Farm and Food Care shares a membership with other provincial farm animal councils in Canada. We also have the food industry represented. So Retail Council of Canada has a membership, and then we have a bunch of associate members. We have Tim Hortons, Loblaw, Sobeys, because they are also interested in what's going on in this field, and it's them that are having their brands challenged on animal welfare. So it's really important when they feel the need to react and respond to an animal welfare challenge that they're part of this conversation as well and communicating to farmers and everyone else in the room what their needs are, and also getting that information back about what are the practical realities that producers are going to face, and realizing sometimes that what might seem like a logical, easy step to take is actually not going to work all that well for them. A&W is not a member, as you will notice. So the codes of practice, I'm still giving feedback. I think it's these two microphones. The codes are our national understanding of farm animal care requirements and recommended practices. So we're looking at creating a level playing field. We don't want a situation where one province decides it's going to regulate whereas another province doesn't, or everyone creates different regulations. We already have enough variability when it comes to animal protection legislation across the country. We don't want to have a situation where different provinces are doing different things and creating an uneven playing field for producers. It's really important that our codes are scientifically informed, and I use that word informed purposefully because in every conversation we know what science might tell us is, but what we do about it can be a very different situation. And so there's a lot of factors that come into play into determining what we ought to do based on what the science is telling us is happening. And ultimately, we have to have defensible codes. So we have to be able to say that they do have a strong science foundation. Codes absolutely have to be practical, and I think you've heard that over and over again from Mike already. Ultimately, if they're not practical, we've wasted a whole lot of time. Now, being practical doesn't mean that the status quo exists or continues. There might be some challenges to achieving what's in the codes, and so there may be timelines laid out in terms of trying to make those accomplishments achievable, but there has to at least be some consideration for the practicality and the economic consequences. And then there's this tricky thing about reflecting societal expectations. We know society's not homogenous. We know that people, for the most part, are not really all that willing to pay more for their food to have some of the standards of care that they claim that they would like. But that doesn't negate the fact that there is concern out there and that the public does care, regardless of whether they're willing to pay for it or not, and may not fully appreciate that the changes that they're asking for, what that may be imposing on producers. So we have to be cognizant of that as well. So that's quite the bundle that we're asking of our codes. And on top of that, the codes are serving a number of roles as well. So we've had codes since the early 80s. This is not new. Canada has been doing this for a long time. We originally envisioned codes as extension tools, a way to get the word out in terms of what was happening on farms and provide some guidance. And that, I think, is still the cornerstone and the core value of what the codes of practice can offer, and certainly with what Impact is aiming to achieve is really a valuable output that the codes can provide. But we know that the codes increasingly are being used by different provinces as reference material for regulation. And I think we're up to 5 provinces now that incorporate the codes by reference. Ontario does not, but there are 5 other provinces that do. And they each do it in a slightly different way, so I'm not going to get into the details around that. But it is something where we have the potential for an uneven playing field. So if we have the codes in place, at least there's a hope that we're going to be doing things consistently across the country. And then a number of you already are dealing with on-farm animal care assessment programs that your national commodities have developed and your provincial ones are delivering. And so those are also based on the codes. And as these new codes come out, a number of industry groups are also looking to update their animal care assessment programs based on their new codes. So these are the completed codes since 2009. Dairy was the first in 2009. And they were our guinea pigs. We were test piloting a new code process back then, And they stepped up, Dairy Farmers of Canada stepped up to the plate and said, we will be your guinea pigs and we will see how well this works. And we learned a lot from that experience, and we learned a whole lot more developing 6 additional codes. The equine, farm mink, farm fox, and beef codes were released in late 2013. And then the pig, excuse me, trying to get rid of the last remnants of a code when you have that tickly cough. And then we have the pig code and the sheep code were released just under the wire of our last bit of project funding in March of 2014. What's important here to recognize is that NFACC has no authority or jurisdiction to tell any group that it will develop a code of practice. Every single one of the national commodity associations for every code that's developed has come forward to NFACC and has said, this is important, we see value in this, we need to update our code, and we want to put our industry forward to do a code update. So the leaders on code updates are you guys. Okay? And that's really important to keep in mind. This isn't government driven, this isn't activist driven, this is industry driven. Codes initiated since 2013, so everything we do is through project-based funding, so just like Impact has a 2-year time frame, our funding ends in March of 2018. Our previous funding ended in March of 2013. We had a 1-year lapse because you're applying for project funding, so we don't have a consistent, ongoing process for how codes are updated. So you see the poultry codes are going to be finished. They were started in our previous project, and they were initiated in 2013. They had a 1-year gap where they kind of sat a bit idle, and we tried to keep things going with teleconferences, but there was no funding in place until our new round of funding was approved through Growing Forward 2. And so those are just gotten off the ground again, and that's not ideal. It's really not ideal to have this stop-start approach to code updates, but it is the reality. We do everything with project funding with very clear deadlines. Bison and veal and rabbit have all stepped up to the plate and said, we want to develop a code of practice. Well, in the case of bison and veal, we want to update our code of practice. Both commodities had existing codes and felt that this was the right time to update those codes. The rabbit sector, no national organization. We were trying to figure out how are we going to deal with rabbits. Michelle, who's in the room, well, she makes a very convincing argument. And ultimately, it was actually the Quebec that stepped forward and said, we will facilitate the development of a rabbit code because we don't have one in Canada, and we will partner with other provinces to help get this done. Some really interesting codes that are going to be developed, very different, and some new challenges that I'm sure the code process will learn more and be updated and evolve as we go forward. So there are 2 teams basically that are responsible for creating the code of practice. We have a scientific committee for every single code of practice. We go to the professional associations on this slide and we say, tell us who are the best and the brightest, preferably in Canada, because we want to, we're dealing in a Canadian environment with Canadian production realities. North American if we need to, and with rabbit, well, we had to go even beyond that. But we're looking for the best and the brightest who are doing research in the species whose code is being updated. And what's really important about our scientific committees that I think is very different from other scientific committees, particularly what you would see happening in Europe, is our code committees have a mandate to produce a report that delivers on the conclusions of the research, but they are not empowered to then tell us what ought to happen. They do not take that extra step of making recommendations based on what the research says. And the reason for that is it's really important that all these other people are involved in that what ought to be discussion. So this is where the producers are going to have a very strong influence. There's usually 4 to 5 producers on a code development committee, and usually additional technical expertise from within the industry. So there's a really strong industry practical knowledge that comes to each code's update. And yes, we have other participants around the Code Development Committee, and I'll explain some of their involvement later on. But this is a very diverse group that either has an interest, a responsibility, an authority, a jurisdiction in animal welfare that are all coming together to develop the codes of practice. So Dr. David Fraser is going to be presenting next. And I love to use this quote because I think he delivered this in 2009 to the National Farm Animal Care Council in a presentation he gave to us. And I really think it resonates. So if government or other logical players do not create animal welfare policy, then someone else will. The question is not whether change will occur, but how it will be managed. And I don't know if you intended for me to use this over and over and over again, but I sure have. And I think, while certainly we can look at this as a threatening scenario, it's also an opportunity to be the orchestrator of your own destiny. In the absence of Canadian codes where farmers are at the table and other standards are going to be applied. And it certainly would be nice to exist without rules and for everyone to just say, do what you want, that's fine, we trust you. The reality is that if well done, the codes serve as an insurance policy for the industry. An insurance policy to ensure that rules developed elsewhere and under different circumstances are not applied carte blanche to our Canadian situation. And to build a common understanding amongst the different groups that do have jurisdiction in animal welfare, because we can all have a different understanding of what's an acceptable body condition score, for example. And so having that common framework from which everyone is looking at what the expectation in animal welfare is really, really important. And it's also a way for farmers to demonstrate, yeah, we do care, and communicate what that standard is that you hold yourselves up to. Now, sorry, my hands go everywhere and I'm a little bit messy. I'm not a farmer. And I have sled dogs. And so, I have to look at my own context sometimes to understand the challenges that you guys face and how you might be feeling about some of these things. Ensuring that the producer voice is heard is really important. This statement was, I wanted to give you an example of how the NFACC code process ended up being used to ensure that those responsible for animal welfare did have a say in standards that were being developed. And it's an example obviously outside of the farming community, but it's one that for me was very interesting because it intersected my professional and my personal life. So are most of you aware of the so-called Whistler sled dog killings back in 2010? Does that ring a bell? It made international headlines. Happened in BC, Whistler, BC. In 2011, the media started reporting that there were up to 100 dogs who were allegedly killed in an inhumane manner by an employee of a Whistler sled dog touring company. As details emerged, the public outrage exploded, and the BC government was hit with worldwide demands to do something. A task force was set up, and they made a number of recommendations, including legislative reforms, and I think that's probably the fastest change in provincial legislation ever. It probably took 2 months. And they also recommended the development of standards of care. So the BC ministry staff were a little freaked out by all of this, and they were very concerned by some of the extreme response that was happening. These were still unproven allegations. Nothing had been proven, but lots of change was already happening. And I got a call. Could the NFACC code process be used to create a sled dog code of practice? And would I be on that code development committee? It was a very cool experience. It's a whole presentation in itself. But the bottom line is that because of the NFACC code process, mushers were part of developing this standard of care. And I can guarantee you that what it would have been created would have been completely unworkable with the people that would have been around that committee if it had not been for the existence of the NFACC code process. So while I can be critical of some of the things that happened because of the political expediency that was happening with the politicians at the time, it was very politically charged. Overall, this is a really good product that dog mushers could live by. So it's outside of the farming experience, but it's certainly my way of relating to just how valuable the codes of practice are. Public comment period. So 15 people or so sit around a code development committee, 4 to 5 producers. That can probably still make you a little nervous. This is your opportunity, public comment periods. And I can tell you this is a real public comment period. It's not just about collecting a bunch of words and then saying, well, we'll do what we want anyway. Every single code has been adjusted and edited as a result of good feedback in that public comment period. So if you have a code that's currently being updated, watch for this and make sure you participate, read it, have your voice heard. We try to make it as easy as possible for people to provide comment, and it's really important because it really does have an impact. One of the questions I quite often get is, why are groups involved that don't have their skin in the game? So usually that relates to the Humane Society. Why are they there? And this slide, this cartoon really resonates for me with when I have 20 dogs. They don't all live in the house, but at this time of year there's a lot of shedding going on, and so a good vacuum cleaner is always handy. So the first bit says, you've been nice to let us study your legendary shedding ability, Louie. And while we're still going to try to develop a machine you can't destroy, it's been great spending the day with you. And the one dog says to the other, the vacuum people seem to like you, Louie. And Louie says, well, you can be on opposite sides of an issue and still keep it friendly, Raymond. So I think when diverse groups, particularly producers and animal welfare groups, sit together around the same table, they often feel that they're on opposite sides of an issue. But what happens as the process unfolds is that that trusting relationships are built, and they start to find common ground, and they start to engage in conversations that are focused on more mutually beneficial agreements, and they find ways to work together towards resolutions. And there's a certain empathy for what producers are dealing with, and an education of the realities of what's happening on farm. The communication goes both ways. So while many of the groups around a code development committee don't have their skin in the game, so to speak, they do have influence, and they will have influence. And so far better to have them in the room and inform them about the issues that producers face on a farm on a daily basis, and also hear from them and understand where they're coming from, because the learning goes both ways, and certainly it's been valuable for our experience up until now. So this is my last slide. These are my dogs on a 200-mile dog race in northern BC. And I like to say that these are amongst the most fulfilled beings on the planet. But the goal of NFACC is really to make sure that everybody is kept on the team, everybody's pulling their weight, and that we get across the finish line together. And it's a long journey, not a sprint race. Thanks.